to media content on geographically remote outgroups located in Europe, namely asylum seekers in Europe, on the attitudes towards the local outgroup, asylum seekers in Israel. This study is based on the parasocial contact hypothesis. Exposure to media content may be considered as parasocial contact. Both the quantity and quality of such contact matter. Exposure to positive portrayals of minorities may be associated with reduced threat implied by them and better attitudes towards local minorities. On the contrary, negative exposure can be associated with high threat and negative intergroup attitudes. In this study, we divided threat into realistic and symbolic. Realistic threat can be conceptualized in economic, physical, and security terms. Symbolic threat includes threats to national identity, cultural values, and social norms. This slide shows the conceptual model of the study. Exposure to positive, neutral, or negative content about asylum seekers in Europe should predict realistic and symbolic threat. And these threats, in turn, predict the attitudes towards asylum seekers in Israel. This research is based on an online survey of more than 1,000 Israeli citizens, and this survey was conducted in 2019. The questionnaire included about 60 questions, and we also controlled for gender, education, age, political views, Israeli identity, and other characteristics. Let's move to results. The study showed that more often respondents were exposed to negative rather than positive or neutral content, and digital media was found to be the main source of negative content about asylum seekers in Europe. Digital media means Facebook, online news, internet blogs, internet chats. We found that frequent exposure to positive content about asylum seekers in Europe was associated with lower realistic and symbolic threat from them, and exposure to negative content was associated with high threat. You can see colored purple negative effects on threat and colored blue positive effects of on threat. We also found negative relationships between realistic and symbolic threats from asylum seekers in Europe and attitudes towards asylum seekers in Israel. The high realistic and symbolic threats were, the more negative attitudes toward asylum seekers in Israel were reported. We also found a so-called secondary transfer effect. Secondary transfer effect means that contact with one group, in our case parasocial contact, may change the attitudes towards another group. In line with this concept, we found that the more frequently Israeli citizens consumed positive stories about asylum seekers in Europe, the more positive their attitudes towards the local minorities, towards asylum seekers in Israel were. But the more frequently they consumed neutral content, the more negative their attitudes were. One possible explanation is that neutral content was dry statistical data. on numbers of asylum seekers in Europe, and maybe Israeli citizens imagine similar statistical trends also in Israel and perceived it as demographic threat. It's surprising, but we didn't find a significant relationship between exposure to negative content and attitudes towards asylum seekers in Israel. So let's move to the conclusion. In sum, we found that more frequent exposure to positive content about asylum seekers in Europe is associated with lower threat, and exposure to negative content is associated with higher threat. Realistic and symbolic threats from asylum seekers in Europe were generalized and carried over to asylum seekers in Israel. We also found an effect of exposure to media content on geographically remote outgroups located in Europe, on the attitudes towards the local outgroups, asylum seekers in Israel. Thus, media framing of remote outgroups can have important local consequences. Positive framing of asylum seekers in Europe in local media may promote tolerance and acceptance of the local outgroups, local minorities. Local media authorities should take into consideration how remote outgroups are described. That's all. Thank you. Okay. Do you have any questions? If you don't have questions, we can move to the next presentation, right? The next presentation should be a presentation of Helen Seitz-Wick. I don't see her. Okay, so Irene Tuzi, are you ready? Please.
So I should be the next one, okay. Okay, thank you everyone. Good evening. My name is Irene Tuzi. I'm a final PhD candidate at Sapienza University of Rome and Humboldt University of Berlin in social sciences. So today I will be presenting my PhD research, which is coming to an end since I'm finalizing the thesis these days.